Okay, welcome everybody. Lovely to see you again on this Wednesday afternoon. I think I'm going to miss them when they're not here, these Wednesday afternoons. But we're talking about Celtic spirituality, and we have had 2 sessions so far. And just to remind us, what have we learned so far? Well, the pagan Celts were Christianized from about 209 AD. Of course, all of the early Christianization had myths and legends attached, maybe true, maybe not true, mostly involving the disciples of Jesus traveling and taking the gospel and so on. The Celts that were there in England and Scotland and Wales and Ireland were people who had migrated over a long time, 7,000 years, 4,000 years, from the Middle East, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Israel area. They'd gone into Turkey, and they might have been encountered by St. Paul when he evangelized among the Galatians, and then of course migrated into Gaul or France, and from there over to the islands. This was before the Angles and the Saxons came. They only came at the time that Rome was sacked in 410 or so. So from about 209 is when we start looking at the British Isles and Ireland, and the end of Celtic Christianity, or the golden age of Celtic Christianity, was 664 when a synod was called, and we'll talk about it today. And a synod was called because the Roman Church was unhappy about the peculiar nature of the Celtic faith, the way it was developing, and they sent somebody called Augustine of Canterbury, and he argued against Aidan of Lindisfarne, the saint that we're going to look at today. They argued the case in front of the king of Northumbria, and the Romans won. And so the Celts were pushed up against the western shore, Highlands and Islands of Scotland, western shore down to Cornwall of the UK, of Great Britain, and then of course they continued to be on the island of Ireland. Celtic faith, St. Patrick, we had a look at the first time, one of the earliest of the saints, the so-called evangelist that brought Christianity to Ireland, and then St. Columba, who worked among the Picts and the Scots. What are some of our sources? Our sources are the lives of the saints, these manuscripts written in a historical fashion about the different saints, and of course the Carmina Gadelica, which Bevan will talk more about next week. Carmina Gadelica is a collection of stories that people used to tell, legends, prayers, and so on, put together by a man called Alexander Carmichael, and one of the most incredible sources of Celtic Christianity that we have available for us today. And then last week we looked at the theologian Pelagius and his creation-affirming theology. Basically, creation was good. You and I are good. We are created in the image and likeness of God, and perfection is possible if we work hard at it, and by God's grace it will be possible. Just a very nature-orientated, creation-orientated faith. We are surrounded by witnesses, and the witnesses are all creation. The sea, the mountains, the animals, and so on, all bear witness to God. That was Pelagius. Of course, he was branded a heretic, and because he came up against Augustine of Hippo, the African bishop, who was such a powerful force in the Western Church and shaped most of what we believe today. On the basis of St. Paul, Augustine said that people are part of the mass damned, the massa damnata. We are born into death, and the reason for that is sin. And it's not just personal human sin, but we're born into original sin. The sin of Adam come down through the ages, and creation is skew. Now, of course, both of these perspectives are true. And as I said last week, You could think of them as two sides of a pendulum swing, with the sin on the one side and the negative power, the destructive power of sin, and the beauty of creation and the positive, the way in which God created everything good on the other side. But in those days, it was one way or the other. And if you didn't side with Augustine and with the Roman Church, then that was the end of you. And that is, of course, what happened to Pelagius. Okay, so today we want to go a little further, and we want to talk about another theologian, this one living not as early as Pelagius did, but after Pelagius in the 9th century. Let me just have a look here. Yeah, so Pelagius, 418, he was excommunicated. Now we go 500 years later, and our theologian is called John Scotus Erigena. And I believe that if you take the Gaelic, that means John the Irishman from Ireland. Don't ask me how, I'm certainly not a Gaelic speaker. But basically this guy was somebody who revived the teaching of Pelagius and was really interested in the Celtic faith and used his opportunities he was both a believer or someone who practiced the Celtic form of faith, but somebody who also shared his Celtic faith with others. And he also sadly came adrift when it came to the Roman Church. So born in the 9th century in Ireland, traveled to France as a young man, was a teacher, and he became the head of the court school of Charles the Bald. Well, I guess it's better than George the Simple, but Charles the Bald was the French king, and John Scotus Erigena was the master of that school. And all of the well-to-do, the king's children and the noble's children and so on, came under the influence of John Scotus Erigena. He was a good teacher, and he was well rewarded by the king, who, Charles the Bald, by the way, later became the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, the Holy Roman Empire was a successor, if you like, to the Roman Empire that was Rome fell in the 5th century. 400 years later, and you'll remember the name Charlemagne and so on. These were Holy Roman emperors. They believed themselves to be in succession from the Caesars of Rome, and a collection of European countries fell under the Holy Roman Empire. Charles the Bald was later the Holy Roman Emperor. John Scotus Erigena was not a monk or a priest. He was a layperson. And yet he was a great proponent of Celtic spirituality. And he was a very fervent reader of the work of Pelagius, and he was fascinated by all of the traditions of the Celtic Church. Now you remember when the Celts became Christian, they experienced a different sort of evangelism than was the custom with the Roman missionaries. The kind of evangelism they experienced was people like Sigalamba or St. Aidan or St. Patrick and all these missionaries would say to them, "Tell us about your faith." Now, of course, these were pagans. Some of them had ties to the Druids. There was a very big influence of the bards. You know what the bards were? The bards were poets. And every king would have a bard or two. And they would recite stories. They were the tellers of stories and the historical memory of the people. So they would tell the story of such and such a king who was king 200 years before. Or such and such a warrior, a knight, or whatever. And the stories like King Arthur and so on, would be carried on through the bardic tradition. They were not religious practitioners of any sort. They were poets, jesters, some of them, and they would entertain. They were great entertainers. Now the bards would tell the stories. And of course, the people who were encountered by the missionaries, they were asked, can you believe, tell us about your faith. Which later missionary people would find a very difficult idea to conceptualize. They didn't really want to know about your faith, because your faith was evil and you were drowning in the pool of burning sulfur of revelation until you accepted the true faith. But it was a method that the Celtic missionaries used. They said, tell us about your faith. And they would tell, the people would tell them about the Druidic faith and the meetings and the circles in nature, or the stone hinges type things and so on. And the missionaries would look for an opportunity to refocus that faith. They would say, okay, no, that's very interesting, but let me tell you about God, Yahweh. They didn't use the word Yahweh, the great God, the high. I mean, you find in some of the stories in Scotland, in Scotland they had a very egalitarian society. There were tribes and clans, and clans live on till today. The Campbells, the MacDonalds, the this, the that. Now, so the Scots did not have just one particular king. They would have a leader, the king of the Scots, and they would call him the High King, because he wasn't the only king. The clan leaders had authority in their own right. Okay, it became a tradition to talk about high kings, ones who are over others, and so on. So the missionaries would use that concept of a high king. Let me tell you about the high king. You may know about other kings, other gods, maybe. But we want to tell you, just like Paul spoke, in the Greek assembly, this unknown God, I want to tell you about him. And that becomes an entry point. It's not like the missionaries believed in all the pagan gods, but they needed an entry point. They needed to be able to explain the gospel in a way that these people could understand. And if they found out something about these people, there was a chance that not all that they found about would be discardable. So in other words, if you tell me about your faith, and you tell me about nature and how you believe God appears in nature, I'm going to tell you about our God, the Christian God, but actually some of the things you're telling me will apply to our God too. It's a very humble way of thinking about things, and it made for a very attractive faith to the Celtic people. Because the missionaries didn't come and say, okay, now everything you believe is invalidated from this day onwards, and from now on we're going to give you a new set of rules and a new set of characteristics for God, and then we can move from there. They were tremendously successful because they wanted to listen, and then they reinterpreted some of the images in a way that would fit with God, with Yahweh, or the High King, the true God of heaven and earth. Okay? So it's a fascinating story from that perspective. But anyway, back to John Scotus Erigena. He was interested in Pelagius' work, but one of the things that fascinated him most is when he read the fourth gospel, the Gospel of John. There was a mysticism there that was not in all of the other gospels. So what is a mysticism? Well, it wasn't just the facts. You weren't listening to the evening news like you were in Luke's gospel or in Matthew. But when you listened to John about the Logos, the word that became flesh, that it existed before the creation of the world, and the light and darkness, the light shining in the darkness can never understand it or put it out. There was a mysticism there that drew people like John Scotus Erigena. Said, we really want to know about this pre-existence, this eternal Logos, the Greek word for word, right? And of course, one of the reasons John is written in that way is that it appeals to the Greek mind, the philosophical mind. It's saying, we're not just going to talk to you about Jesus of Nazareth, we're going to talk to you about the Messiah who existed before the world began. He was like a word, but this word was effective. The word was used to create the world, etc., etc. So John Scotus Erigena, really keen on John's Gospel and his letters. And he was also somebody who emphasized the divine goodness of God. God is so unbelievably good, so unbelievably pure, so unbelievably holy. Nothing can interfere with God's goodness, and the image of God in us carries that goodness. Of course, the darkness and light motif, which is carried right through John's Gospel. And then he was also fascinated by the angels and heavenly beings mentioned in the Bible. Now, by the way, you know that the word angel from the Greek angelos simply means messenger. It's an ordinary word. We've made it into a word. So the Greeks read the New Testament back in Jesus' day. Wherever you see angel, like Gabriel, they read messenger. And it's like somebody running down the street with a note in his hand. So this concept of an angel is the product of our imagination, not the New Testament writers. Because when they wrote about angels, they were talking about messengers, the same as any other messenger you ever met before in your life, right? It's fascinating. We made it up. We created it. It's okay, because heavenly messengers are important, and God does send them, and he sent them, and they sat with Abram and Sarah under the tree of Mamre, and appeared to Mary to announce that she would bear the Savior of the world. But the word angel is a product of our English, we created it. So he was fascinated by this notion of a heavenly messenger and the heavenly beings. And of course, when he read Revelation, he got a number of other beings to add to his menagerie of beings. There were 4 living creatures, and there were dragons, and there were beasts, and all manner of things in the book of Revelation, and in Daniel, and in some of the other extra testamentary stuff. But John Scotus Erigena basically taught that you and I are surrounded by heavenly beings. I love the story of the king of Aram and his army, and Elisha looking out and saying to his servant comes in and says, "We're surrounded." Because the king of Aram wanted to put an end to this prophet, because what he said in his bedroom to his own wife was being reported to the king of Israel. He had no privacy nowhere when it came to Elisha the prophet. And the servant is terrified because they're so overwhelmed. They're about to be killed. And Elisha prays that the Lord will open the eyes of his servant. And when he goes out again, the servant looks and he sees the heavenly army is greater than the army of the king of Aram. And I think that's such a powerful story, because when you and I are faced with challenges and obstacles and things like that, which we think are insurmountable, we just need to tune our eyes a little and see that our God is so much stronger than any problem or obstacle, and is able to help us to overcome. But of course, we don't often have the eyes to see. Okay. Light and darkness motif. The light has not been lost, but rather a true beholding of the light from the inner eyes. Interest in angels and heavenly beings. He saw Jacob's ladder connecting heaven and earth. This was also, he must have been an early mystic, because Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross and all those magnificent mystics of the church had these visions in which they saw Jacob's ladder and things like this. And John Scotus Erigena was just a mystic. That's what he was. And the British writer Evelyn Undiel always said, if you're scared of the mystics, if you think they're excessive, if you worry about their mental health, then you must remember that any excess of the mystics, she was a fantastic writer, Evelyn Undiel. She said, any excess of the mystics can be explained away by the simple common sense of the church. And I thought that is so solid and practical advice. If somebody goes into a flight of fancy about heavenly beings and things like that, and you're not 100% sure, just use your common sense. And that's enough. You don't have to go wild and excommunicate them. Anyway, so John Scotus Erigena, condemned by the Pope in 1225, and in 1685, his writing is placed on the dreaded and infamous Index of Banned books, of which the list is very long. And poor Galileo just got off that recently. So that's just another example of somebody who was important to the Celtic tradition, and who contributed to the flowering of the Celtic faith. By the way, one of the things that Bevan will probably cover next week is that the sadness about the Celts and their faith is that even the reformers, the dour old Presbyterians, John Knox, etc., were not very happy with the Celts. They were just a little bit too out of control for the liking of the reformers. The reformers liked everything to have straight lines. So even the Presbyterians, who inherited the Scots, at least the Celtic faith, really battled, to accept some of the things that the Celts said. Just one thought before I go on to the saint. I remember some years ago having an opportunity to visit Edinburgh, and also the St. Giles, which is we call it the High Church, because a cathedral is somewhere where a bishop sits. A cathedra is a seat of a bishop, and Presbyterians don't have bishops. We think bishops and witchcraft are just two sides of the same coin. So there's no cathedra, there's no seat for a bishop. Okay. Incidentally, our Anglican church here is becoming a cathedral on Pentecost Sunday. So it's the seat of a bishop. In this case, a lady bishop, Margaret Virtue. Margaret. Yeah. Anyway, so St. Giles is not a cathedral. There's no cathedra, no seat. So the fascinating thing was, we had this opportunity to go, and I'm a little bit taking advantage of situations. So I thought to myself, I'm not going to walk through St. Giles as a tourist if a colleague of mine is a minister there. I don't know him from a bar of soap, but he is a colleague of mine, because he and I are both Presbyterian ministers. So I pick up the phone and I ring through to St. Giles, and I say, put me through to the minister, please. Ooh, who are you? And so on. Anyway, eventually Finlay MacDonald was the minister, and so I was put through, and I said to him, look, I hope you don't think I'm presumptuous here, but we're coming, and my colleague who's coming with me is the General Secretary of the Presbyterian Church here, and the ministry, the person in charge of the ministry, Dr. George Marchinkowski, is coming, and the three of us are coming, and we wondered whether you could give us a personal tour of St. Giles. With pleasure, he said. Well, little did I know, he became minister of St. Giles the year I was born. So I was a bit out of my depth there, but anyway, nothing ventured, nothing gained. Anyway, it was so lovely. We arrived there, and he said, come, he said it'll look like wood paneling, but it is a door into his office. It's actually very well hidden. So his vestry and that, and the secretary's office and everything, is you come into St. Giles, into the church itself, and there's a piece of wood paneling with a door handle on it, and you go through there. And anyway, so he took us around, and we walked around the whole place. He showed us the chapel to the Order of the Thistle, which is the Scottish equivalent of what the great orders that the Queen bestows, the honours that she bestows. And we came to the end of it, and it's a peculiar church, because the pulpit is, if the church in length is like that, and that's the door, and you're walking through the church, when you get to the middle, you get to the pulpit. And the pulpit is sitting on the side of the church and looking out that way. So you stand in the pulpit like this, the church goes that way, the church goes that way, and also there are a few seats looking straight at the pulpit. It's fascinating. It's not like up here, and you're sitting looking at the end of the length. It's not like that. So we spoke with him, and he told us some stories and things like that. And when we got to the door of the church, just about to leave, I said to him, how comes people sometimes refer to St. Giles as a cathedral, but it is a Presbyterian church, and so we don't have a cathedra. Because I know the right way to speak about it is as a high church. We talk about the high church, St. Giles. So he said, well, do you realize that at the Reformation, that's the 16th century, now I think he was exaggerating a bit, but you'll get what he said. One Sunday we were Catholic, and the next Sunday we were Presbyterian. Same church.
Sure.
They didn't break it down. They may have rearranged it slightly on the inside. They took away the altar and things like that. But it's the same church that has gone back hundreds of years before the Reformation. And in the Reformation, it became a Catholic church. And I think we have to, at least a Presbyterian church, we have to remember that. It's a continuous history. Things may have changed, but the history is continuous. And in the case of John Scotus Regina, he was coming into this church that was now thoroughly Catholic in the UK. The Celts were small communities. They may have done their own thing or believed their own thing, but when they went to church on Sundays, they did it the Roman way. That was it. There was no alternatives allowed. Church of England only came in the 16th century. In the 9th century, it was Roman Catholic or nothing. Questions, comments, thoughts?
St. Giles sounds like the crooked cake near Profanity Street. And the pulpit's in the middle.
Oh, is there pulpit set in the middle as well? Okay.
The length of the church is sideways.
Yes. Okay, I didn't know that. Yeah, it's interesting. I think I might have told you about the time when I attended as moderator, and we were told we needed to bring our robes. Now, you know, it's not a very easy thing to transport when you're going overseas. And the robes of a moderator have these tassels on them. They're called frogs with 2 G's. They're these tassels. And it's a very heavy thing that, you know, you have to put on. It looks a bit silly. I was quite glad to donate mine to a colleague of mine who became moderator, because I felt awkward in that thing. Anyway, so now we have to take this thing over. Now, you know, you think, are you going to be wearing it all the time? What do they want us to take robes for? And turns out that their special service at St. Giles is in the middle. So you start assembly halfway through the week. In the middle you have the service, and then you have another few days of assembly. And so the day came, and we were told that we had to robe, and we had to process all the leaders of foreign churches, you know, like India and Caribbean or wherever. And I was quite friendly with this man who was the moderator of the Presbyterian Church of Trinidad and Tobago. They didn't have robes. They just, you know, wore a dog collar. I think in Trinidad and Tobago it's too hot to wear robes anyway. So the morning came, and we were on that side, and Sasha went into the church and sat in the congregation, but there was a special section set apart, and what a procession it was, you know. The judges came in from one side with their wigs and their, you know, judicial robes. The city council came in with, you know, these chains and things like that. And then we came in from our side. But when we were robing, the moderator of Trinidad and Tobago was absolutely entranced by all the different colors and shapes of robes. So we're walking through this library that we're robed in, and the robes are hanging. You know, they put up, you know, like almost like they do for the celebrities, you know, when they get dressed for a show. These rails and all these robes up, and we looked this way, and there was a black one, and that one had a blue stripe, and so on. And he looked that way, and there was a scarlet red robe with a white fluffy trim. And he said, "My God, Santa Claus is here." I don't know where that guy came from. Anyway. Okay, well, let's talk about our saint for the day. I had a lovely privilege one year of visiting Durham and Newcastle on the east coast of England. Northumbria is what they call it. And one day, a colleague who was there took me out to Holy Island. Holy Island, Lindisfarne, is an island off the eastern coast, the northeast of England. And Lindisfarne was also, like Iona, a place where a monastery was built, a platform from which missionaries moved around that area. And what I remember is you couldn't drive there when it was high tide because the water came over the road, but when it was low tide you could drive through, and so you had to time your visit very carefully. But the saint that we're dealing with today is St. Aidan. Some of these icons that they paint are quite attractive. This one, not so much. Those big eyes and the gaunt face and the long beard. St. Aidan of Lindisfarne was an Irishman, born in Ireland in 590 and died in 651. His biographer, the Venerable Bede, and Bevan will know we had to read Bede's ecclesiastical history when we were studying church history. Bede was the historian who covered the UK and Great Britain in those early days. He was a monk and a missionary who brought Christianity to Northumbria, the northeast of England. He was a monk on Iona, can you believe? He was sent from Iona. Iona is on the west of Scotland. It's opposite Oban in Scotland, and you can access it from the Isle of Mull, which is right next door to it and much bigger. It's a small island. So the island of Iona became a locus established by St. Columba for missionaries, and here we have one of the first pupils, so to speak, the ones who learnt their trade on the island of Iona. And he was sent. Now, apparently, he wasn't the first to be sent. There was another chap sent. I'm trying to find his name here. But he didn't go down very well. Corman was his name, Corman. They sent Corman, but he was too harsh. So they sent him back. And Aidan was sent as a second attempt to evangelize the people of Oswald, King of Northumbria. You remember that prior to the establishment of a monarchy in England, there were city-states. There were Anglo-Saxon city-states. And King Oswald was one of the kings of that top area. And those city-states were gradually condensed into dukedoms and eventually put together into the United Kingdom. Well, first of England and then England and Scotland together. So Aidan was a monk on Iona. He was known for his strict asceticism, and he was very, very austere in many ways, but a very gentle personality. He pushed, he offered Christianity, many were saved, but the pagan Angles and Saxons, the Germanic tribes, really gave him a hard time. But he became connected with Oswald, King of Northumbria. And when in 634 Oswald regained the throne of Northumbria after being in exile, he requested missionaries from Iona. Let's just have a look. Sometimes but it continues. Yeah, it's still going. Oswald requested missionaries from Iona. And as I said, they sent Corman, but he was too harsh. And Aidan was sent, and he chose Lindisfarne, which was close to the castle at Bamberg. Not the Bamberg as in German Bamberg, but there was a Bamberg in Northumbria as his base. He was a people's person, apparently very polite, spoke to people at their own level. He was interested in people, and Christianity was brought to Northumbria. Apparently Oswald was quite talented when it came to languages, the king, and he would translate from Gaelic Irish into English. so that when the monks arrived and they couldn't speak the local tongue, they would be able to communicate. They built churches together, monasteries and schools, and of course Lindisfarne became a center of learning and scholarly knowledge. In the 8th century, the famous Lindisfarne manuscript was produced. It was a Latin copy of the Gospels. And in the 10th century, Lindisfarne produced the first Old English translation, which is now still in the British Library in London. Aidan died on the 31st of August, 651, and was buried beneath the abbey at Lindisfarne. So, just a few little pieces from Aidan's life. The first is a story about St. Aidan's sculpture. The famous sculpture of St. Aidan on Holy Island has 4 features which has much to say to all of us. The 4 features are his face, his torch, his staff, and his Celtic cross. Aidan's face looks out to the future and south to the unevangelized regions of England with faith-filled vision. Which places does Christ want Aidan to give his attention? Aidan takes with him from the past the torch of faith to hand on to others as a living flame. To whom does God want Aidan to hand the flame of faith? Aidan carried everywhere with him his pastoral staff, a sign of gentle love and compassion for all. There is something else in the sculpture which we must never forget. Behind and above Aidan, as a shield wherever he goes, is a cross with a circle. For Aidan had a sacrificial mission to plant a cross in the soil of a new land and in the soul of its people. The circle meant that the message of the cross was to encompass all. It was not just to be a message, but an experience of the cross to be lived and applied in every area of life, every moment of the day. No gain without pain, no false triumphalism, no words divorced from humble service. Only so will our dreams and resolutions survive the rocks of cruel human nature. Only so will setbacks be surmounted and the serene strength of Christ still be ours as we journey on in faith. Now, there's also numerous poems and prayers and things like that. I've just captured 2 of them for you. The first one. God be with you at every leap. Christ be with you on every steep. Spirit be with you in every deep. Each step of the journey you go, all that I do, all whom I'll meet, all that I'll ever be, I offer now to you. And another one, a blessing. May the raindrops fall lightly on your brow. May the soft winds freshen your spirit. May the sunshine brighten your heart. May the burdens of the day rest lightly upon you. And may God enfold you in love. These are all, little wishes and things like that. There wasn't just 1 or 2. I know we know the old Irish blessing quite well, but there were many, hundreds of these sorts of blessings. A little story from St. Aidan. Oswin, who was king of Deira for 7 years of great prosperity, was tall, handsome, courteous, a man of pleasant conversation, who treated people of all backgrounds in an open manner. As a result, he was loved by everyone. He was especially graced with virtues that spring from self-denial, and in particular with humility, as the following episode illustrates. The king had given a highly bred horse to Aidan, so that although it was Aidan's custom to walk, he could ride it across rivers for urgent missions. Not long afterwards, Aidan met a poor beggar and gave him the horse with all its expensive trappings, for Aidan was like a father to those in need. When the king was told of this before dinner that night, he angrily asked Aidan, "Why did you give the royal horse to a beggar? We have other things and less valuable horses, which can be given to the poor without giving away the horse that I specially chose for you, for your own use." "What are you saying?" Aidan instantly replied. "Surely that son of a mare is not more precious to you than that son of God." As the king warmed himself by the fire, Aidan's words smote him. He threw down his sword, fell at Aidan's feet, and asked for forgiveness. "Never again," he said, "will I speak of this or pass judgment on what wealth of mine you should give to God's children." Aidan was moved to tears by the king's words. A priest asked him why he was weeping. "I know that the king has not long to live," Aidan told him. "I have never seen a humble king before, and I therefore expect he will soon be taken from this life. This nation does not deserve to have such a ruler." The grim prophecy was indeed shortly fulfilled when on the 20th of August, 11 days later, Aidan himself died, perhaps in part of a broken heart. Aidan and the silver dish. The story is told that one Easter day, when King Oswald sat down with Bishop Aidan, a silver dish was placed on the table before him, full of rich foods. They had just raised their hands to ask a blessing on the bread, when there came in an officer of the king, whose duty it was to relieve the needy, telling him that a great multitude of poor people from every district was sitting in the precincts and asking alms of the king. He at once ordered the dainties which had been set in front of him to be carried to the poor, the dish to be broken up and the pieces divided among them. The bishop who was sitting by was delighted with this devoted action, grasped Oswald by the right hand and said, "May this hand never decay." His blessing and his prayer were fulfilled in this way. When Oswald was killed in battle, his hand and his arm were cut off from the rest of his body, and they have remained uncorrupted until this very present time. They are in fact preserved in a silver shrine in St. Peter's Church in the royal city of Bamberg.
This is a blessing.
Oh no. Well, different times, eh? Aidan's love of people. Gentleness has soothing qualities such as politeness, kindness, and courtesy. Yet it is also a firestorm of indignation kindled by the wrongs and sufferings of others. In no one does this quality shine forth more clearly than in Aidan. Among the lessons that Aidan gave the clergy about their lifestyle, none was more salutary than his own example of fasting and self-discipline. Devin, from tomorrow, eh? His teaching won the hearts of people because he thought that he and his followers lived out. He taught what he and his followers lived out. He neither sought nor cared for the possessions of this world, and he loved to give away to the poor gifts he received from the rich. In those days, poor people would travel by foot, and the influential by horse. Aidan, however, insisted on traveling by foot into the country as well as in town, unless some urgent necessity forced him to do otherwise. So wherever he walked, he was able to catch sight of people, rich or poor, and talk to them straight away. If they were not Christians, he would invite them to accept the mystery of faith. If they already believed, he would strengthen their faith and encourage them by his words and example in the practice of Christian giving and the words of mercy. I have described his love of peace and charity, temperance and humility, his soul which triumphed over anger and greed, and at the same time despised pride and vainglory, and his tenderness in comforting the weak, in relieving and protecting the poor. That's from the writings of the Venerable Bede. So that's St. Aidan for you. St. Aidan of Lindisfarne, Holy Island, off the northeast coast of England, across from Durham, Newcastle, and so on. Newcastle upon Tyne.
Is that a picture of it?
Yes, that's the picture of the abbey up there on the hill on Holy Island. Okay. Let's see. How are we doing for time? Any last questions before we go on to the song? Yes, Liz?
Just wondering why they settled on islands that were difficult to access. Was it for protection or for whatever? I mean, how did you get pilgrims going to Ireland?
Yeah.
It just seems a strange place
Yes.
to start a ministry.
It was a strange place. I don't know the full answer to that. I've got a few ideas. One of them was protection. It was remote, and it was not easy to get to and from the island of Iona. In the case of Iona, it was a monastery that trained missionaries. In the case of Holy Island, it was more than that. It was an educational center. They taught people to read and write, and of course they had that magnificent ministry of illuminated manuscripts. And in fact, I watched a film once where they were showing the attack of Lindisfarne. When the Normans came, the Vikings, they attacked Lindisfarne and they burnt it. And some of those magnificent manuscripts were destroyed. So it was certainly not impregnable. They didn't have very much in the way of protection, but it was remote. And I guess there's something about leaving, your community. So for the monks that gave themselves into that service, it was a real leaving community and going to this remote place and allowing God to use the remoteness of that place as part of how to change you and make you ready to do His, to spread His gospel.
Temptations would fall through there.
Oh, I guess so, yeah. Yeah. There was no bars on the island of Iona, let alone Holy Island. Thank you, everybody. Let's say a prayer and then we'll go. Lord, we bless and thank you for the things that bring us joy, even if it is the tune of a hymn that makes memories flood back and turns our heart towards you in ways that we couldn't do if it weren't for that access point, for the words of this beautiful, beautiful song that think of a day, that visualize a day when you really will be enthroned as King among us. We thank you for the Celts again and their heritage which we share, the beauty of what they have done, especially St. Aidan of Lindisfarne and John Scottus Regina, who have been the subject of our conversation today. So now as we go home, go with us where we go, stay with us where we stay. Hem us in from the left and from the right, so that we can always be surrounded by the presence of Jesus.